This video is intended solely for educational and documentary purposes. It contains no ideology or propaganda. 3/4 of the crews never returned. The tragedy of the German U-boat fleet. War diaries often reduce immense human suffering to dry statistics, but behind each number lies a face, a family, and an unrealized future. One of the darkest chapters of the Second World War played out under the waves of the Atlantic. Nazi Germany built more than 1,000 submarines, known as U-boats, and turned them into the main instrument of its attempt to strangle Britain by cutting off the sea lanes. Yet behind the apparent successes of this undersea campaign, there was a terrible human cost of roughly 40,000 men who served aboard the U-boats. About 30,000 were killed. 3 out of every 4 submariners who slipped from a quay in the grey dawn never set foot on land again. This film explores why the casualty rate was so high. It asks how a nation that excelled at designing and deploying submarines was nevertheless unable to protect the very crews that manned them. We will travel from clandestine shipyards to cramped control rooms, from the ecstasy of a successful attack to the terror of depth charges exploding overhead. We will meet young men who regarded the sleek hulls as both homes and coffins, and commanders who were worshipped by their crews and feared by their enemies. Along the way, we will examine the technology, the strategy, the psychology, and the ideology that together turned the Atlantic into a graveyard. From the Versailles Band to the wolf packs. When Germany emerged from the defeat of the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles stripped the nation of its submarines and forbade it from building new ones. For many naval officers, this was not just a humiliation, but also a tactical blind spot. They believed that the submarine had been Germany's most effective maritime weapon, and that, if properly used, it could still change the course of any future war. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, under the cover of commercial deals with Dutch and Spanish shipyards, engineers quietly designed new hulls. Young naval cadets practiced their skills on surface vessels, while dreaming of an underwater arm they were not supposed to have. One of those cadets was a driven, ambitious officer named Karl Dönitz. His obsession with underwater war led him to develop the doctrine of tonnage warfare. The idea that victory could be achieved by sinking merchant ships faster than the enemy could replace them. By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Kriegsmarine had 57 operational submarines. Most of these were small coastal boats incapable of sustained Atlantic patrols, but several ocean-going Type 7 boats were already prowling the shipping lanes. On 14th October 1939, the U-47, commanded by Günther Prien, slipped into the British naval base at Scapa Flow and torpedoed the battleship HMS Royal Oak, sending nearly 800 sailors to the bottom. The raid electrified the German public and demonstrated that the U-boat arm, though small, could strike deep and hard. Over the next 6 months, a period the German press called the Happy Time, Prien and fellow commanders such as Otto Kretschmer, U-99, and Joachim Mützelberg, U-203, hunted lone freighters under cover of darkness and storms. With the British convoy system still rudimentary, U-boats sometimes sank 10 ships in a single patrol. Losses were already significant. 28 submarines were lost in 1939 alone, victims of mines, collisions, or aggressive British destroyers. These setbacks were hidden behind propaganda that portrayed the U-boat crews as modern knights. Thousands of young men volunteered, drawn by patriotism, a desire for adventure, and the promise of comradeship. Under the steel docks at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, they assembled in training flotillas, where instructors taught navigation, engine maintenance, torpedo theory, and damage control. Dönitz himself drilled them on tactics. They would attack not individually, but in coordinated groups he called Rudel, wolf packs. By concentrating half a dozen submarines on a convoy and attacking at night on the surface, the Germans hoped to overwhelm the escort and unleash their torpedoes at close range. Discipline on board was absolute. The captain was regarded as the eyes and mind of the boat, burdened with making life or death decisions in seconds. He alone was allowed to survey the horizon, read the latest orders, and shape the patrol plan. Officers were selected carefully, drilled relentlessly, and expected to lead from the front. Before taking command of a combat vessel, they served aboard older training boats, learning every valve and circuit, mastering the art of balancing a steel cylinder between the crushing pressure below and the vulnerability of the surface above. How a U-boat worked. The most common submarine of the early war years, the Type 7C, was a steel tube about 67 meters long and 6 meters across. It was divided by bulkheads into 7 compartments: a forward torpedo room, a tiny living space, a central command post, a radio room, a diesel engine room, an electric motor room, and an aft torpedo room. Every spare centimetre was filled with equipment. Bunks were squeezed between torpedoes and battery banks. Ropes of high-pressure air lines hung overhead. Navigation tables doubled as dinner tables. Each boat mounted 4 torpedo tubes in the bow and 1 in the stern, carried up to 14 self-propelled torpedoes, and was armed with an 8.8 centimetre deck gun and a 20mm anti-aircraft cannon. On the surface, the twin diesel engines produced a respectable 17 knots. Submerged, the electric motors could manage about 7. Design compromises turned these boats into formidable weapons, but also into fragile shells. Many were built hurriedly in sections and welded together with poor quality steel. Seams sometimes leaked. Hydraulic and fuel lines were routed outside the pressure hull, where they could be smashed by a single depth charge, and paint and insulation corroded quickly in salt water. Officially, Type 7 boats were rated safe to 200 meters. In practice, captains sometimes took their boats deeper to avoid attacks, gambling that the hull would hold. The boats carried crews of 45 to 52 men: officers, petty officers, mechanics, electricians, radio operators, cooks, medics, and torpedo specialists. Their combined average age was barely over 20. Larger Type 9 boats, 76 meters long, had longer range and could carry more provisions. To support them, the Germans built supply submarines known as Milchkuhe, or milk cows, lumbering Type 14 vessels loaded with fuel, torpedoes, and food, to resupply combat boats in mid-ocean. During the war, 568 Type 7C boats were launched, along with 91 improved Type 7C/41 boats with lighter hulls and increased diving depth. As the Allies deployed long-range aircraft, German engineers responded with the Schnorchel, a tube that allowed a submerged submarine to run its diesel engines while drawing air from above the surface. Introduced in 1943, it extended underwater endurance, but also caused headaches and ear pain when faulty valves sucked oxygen from the boat. Batteries and motors required constant care. Magnetic torpedo detonators, designed to explode beneath a ship's keel, often malfunctioned early in the war, forcing crews to risk closer shots with contact pistols. Every technical innovation brought its own dangers. Life and discipline on board. The interior of a Type 7 had roughly the same volume as a modern passenger jet, yet more than 36 men lived inside for weeks at a time. So much space was taken up by fuel, ammunition, and machinery that the crew had only 35 bunks. Watchkeepers practiced hot bunking, 6-hour shifts followed by sleep in someone else's warm bed. When the boat was full of supplies at the start of a patrol, sacks of potatoes and crates of eggs were wedged into the washroom, between torpedoes and even under floorboards. There was only one toilet for the entire crew, located next to the captain's tiny cabin and often used as a pantry. Showers were a luxury they could not afford. Water was rationed because the distillation plant produced less than 240 litres per day, most of which went into the batteries. Sailors washed their faces with diesel fuel or alcohol and used towels soaked in vinegar to wipe off grime. Clothes were rarely changed. In tropical waters, men wore only shorts and canvas shoes. By the end of a voyage, every surface was sticky with oil and sweat. Food reflected the German reputation for organisation. Before sailing, each boat loaded 12 tons of provisions: ham, sausage, cheese, dark bread, tins of butter, vegetables, fruit, chocolate, and sacks of coffee. Fresh food spoiled quickly in the heat of the engine room, and sailors joked that one could chart the progress of a U-boat by the smell. By mid-voyage, meals consisted of canned meat, pea soup, and hard biscuits. If supplies ran low, the cook concocted imaginative stews, mixing dried beans with sausage ends, and even fish caught with a makeshift line. The men valued citrus fruits and sauerkraut because they prevented scurvy. Life was dominated by routine. A standard day was divided into 4-hour watches: 4 hours on duty, 4 hours off to sleep, and 4 hours for maintenance or training. Navigation and radio operators hunched over their equipment, while engine room crews listened for changes in pitch that might indicate a fault. Silence was crucial. When submerged, crew members whispered. Even so, there were moments of camaraderie and humour. To keep morale high, the men organised haircuts and shaving sessions in the torpedo room, listened to recordings of operas and Viennese waltzes, played harmonicas and card games, and told jokes about life back home. At Christmas, they decorated the wardroom with tiny evergreen branches, lit electric candles and sang carols, their voices mingling with the hum of pumps. In letters read aloud by the captain, wives and children sent encouragement and news of births, harvests, and bombings. Such simple rituals reminded them that they were human beings, not cogs in a war machine. Smell was an omnipresent element. Diesel fumes, oil, sweat, and unwashed clothing combined in a miasma that penetrated everything, including food. After a few weeks, the sailors no longer noticed it, but any newcomer was overwhelmed. Decay and fermentation were constant companions. Vegetables rotted, potatoes sprouted, fruit moulded, and a sack of onions might turn slimy overnight. The only fresh air came when the boat surfaced and threw open the hatches. On those occasions, men crowded onto the small deck, gulping cold wind, scanning the horizon and sharing a cigarette. The simple act of breathing clean air became a luxury they craved. Despite the discomforts, there was remarkable cohesion. Crews were drawn from all parts of the Reich. Farm boys from East Prussia bunked beside engineers from Munich and university students from Hamburg. They called themselves Brüder der Grauen Wölfe, Brothers of the Grey Wolves, and forged a bond of loyalty that transcended class and region. As one veteran wrote later, the men of the submarines were knights of a new kind, bound not by swords, but by rivets, held together by the pressure of the deep and the expectation of death. Life during a patrol. Every patrol began with a ceremony. Women and children, wearing their best coats, gathered on the quaysides of French and Norwegian bases to watch fathers, sons and husbands depart. Musicians played brass marches, nurses handed out flowers, and chaplains offered blessings. Men carried their sea bags up the gangway, hugged their loved ones, and disappeared below deck. Once the boat cast off, the world of land vanished behind them. The crew entered a sphere of salt water and steel, where time was measured not by calendars, but by depth readings. In transit to the patrol area, the boat remained on the surface to conserve battery power and increase speed. Lookouts scanned the horizon through binoculars, searching for smoke plumes or aircraft shadows. When a plane appeared, the captain ordered a crash dive. Alarms sounded, men scrambled through hatches, watertight doors were sealed, and air hissed as ballast tanks flooded. Within seconds, the boat plunged under the waves, the outside world replaced by the dim red glow of control panel lights. The commander stood at the periscope, breathing through his mouthpiece, eyes fixed on the horizon. Patience was as vital as courage. Days or weeks could pass without sighting a single ship. Crewmen calibrated torpedoes, cleaned diesel engines, tested bilge pumps, and calibrated depth gauges. They played chess on makeshift boards and read dog-eared thrillers. They checked the hydrophones, listening to the faraway thump of propellers. Every now and then, a coded message arrived from headquarters or another U-boat, signaling the location of a convoy. Then boredom gave way to adrenaline. The boat altered course, engines throttled up, and the entire crew prepared for action. U-boat tactics evolved over time. In the early years, single boats shadowed convoys, transmitting their position and course to headquarters. Other submarines would converge, forming a loose line ahead of the enemy. At night, using the darkness as cover, they attacked on the surface at high speed. When within range, they fired spreads of torpedoes to increase the chance of a hit. A successful attack was followed by an immediate dive, an abrupt turn, and a descent to 100 meters. The silence returned, broken only by the mechanical ticking of gyros and the muffled thunder of exploding torpedoes. Two emotions dominated life aboard: boredom and terror. A sailor could spend hours wiping down a diesel only to be thrown across the compartment by a sudden evasive dive. He could lounge in his bunk, reading a battered magazine, only to be wrenched awake by the crackle of the intercom and the captain's terse order: "Find voraus, enemy ahead." An explosion might come at any time from any direction. The depth charge pattern of a destroyer, the shriek of dive bombers overhead, or the screech of a bomber's machine guns could send shockwaves through the hull. When a series of dull thumps echoed through the compartments, men held their breath, hoping the hull would hold. In his memoirs, Reinhard Hartigan, one of the most successful commanders, recalled how time seemed to stretch during an attack. "When we dived, everything apart from the instruments ceased to exist. We knew they were hunting us, but we could only wait." Operation Drumbeat, the attack on America's coast. At the beginning of 1942, the undersea war expanded beyond its usual hunting grounds. After Germany declared war on the United States, Dönitz ordered his commanders to strike at the merchant vessels along the American Atlantic seaboard. The operation was given the musical code name Drumbeat. The first wave of large Type 9 boats set out across the ocean at the worst possible time for their new adversary. The United States had not yet implemented convoy tactics or enforced coastal blackouts. The eastern seaboard glittered at night, with hotels, promenades, and cities illuminated as if peace still reigned. Tankers and freighters ploughed the coastal routes singly, their silhouettes standing out against a backdrop of lights. Commanders of U-123 and U-130 later wrote that they could count the cars on shore from their conning tower. For several months, the results were devastating. Dozens of oil tankers, ore carriers, and passenger ships were sunk just a few miles off beaches from New York to Florida. In the warm, clear waters of the Gulf Stream, torpedoes ran true, and there were no storms to hinder aim. American sailors were inexperienced, and equipment for anti-submarine warfare was scarce. U-boats often attacked in broad daylight, firing at close range and escaping unscathed. Newspaper headlines screamed about German pirate submarines ravaging shipping. Yet the very success of Drumbeat sowed the seeds of its undoing. The long transit from French bases meant each boat remained at sea for up to 90 days, stretching supplies and straining crews. As American politicians and naval officers realized the scale of the losses, they ordered cities to dim their lights, organized convoys escorted by destroyers and patrol aircraft, and set up radar stations. Within a few months, the easy pickings disappeared. Subsequent German attempts to revive the campaign resulted in more U-boats lost than ships sunk. Drumbeat was a stark demonstration that an unprepared enemy could be brought to its knees by a handful of submarines, and that preparedness could reverse the tide just as quickly. Mediterranean and Arctic theatres. Another front in the hidden war lay in the azure waters of the Mediterranean. To get there, submarines had to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar, a narrow, heavily defended channel with strong currents and bright searchlights. Many boats were caught and destroyed in the attempt. Those that succeeded faced new perils. The Mediterranean is shallow and clear, making it easy for aircraft to spot the thin trail of a periscope. Allied fighters and torpedo bombers range from bases in Malta, North Africa, and the Middle East. Nonetheless, a few spectacular successes boosted German morale. In November 1941, U-81 torpedoed the British carrier HMS Ark Royal off Malta. Another boat, U-331, sank the battleship HMS Baham. But each victory came at great cost. Dockyard facilities were limited. Repairs could only be made in Italian or Greek ports that themselves were targets for Allied bombers. By 1943, most German submarines in the Mediterranean had been sunk, their hulls lying on sandy seabeds. Far to the north, under grey skies and among floating ice, U-boats stalked Arctic convoys carrying Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union. The PQ and JW series of convoys sailed from Scotland and Iceland to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Temperatures plunged below -20 Celsius. Seawater froze to railings. Men's faces burned with cold whenever hatches were opened. Magnetic compasses swung erratically near the pole. Radio waves behaved unpredictably, and batteries discharged quickly in the icy water. Icebergs, pack ice, and towering waves threatened to crush or capsize a submerged boat. Yet commanders were drawn north by the prospect of rich prizes. Loaded merchant ships escorted by warships already stretched thin across other theatres. In June 1942, during the disastrous PQ-17 convoy, German U-boats and aircraft combined to sink 24 of the 35 Allied vessels after the escorts were ordered to scatter. But subsequent convoys were more heavily defended. British and Soviet destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft carriers guarded the lifeline, while Soviet aircraft flew patrols from northern airfields. The cramped seas, unrelenting cold, and long summer days or winter nights made the Arctic one of the most dangerous and psychologically taxing environments. Sailors wrote that the cold creeps into your bones and your thoughts, and that the endless white horizon was as oppressive as any depth charge. Allied defensive measures. For the first 2 years of the Atlantic struggle, the German underwater fleet dominated the sea lanes, but the Allies responded with a combination of science, organisation, and industrial might that steadily eroded the U-boat's advantage. The British began to route merchant ships in convoys, grouping 30 or 40 slow freighters together and surrounding them with destroyers, corvettes, and armed trawlers. Convoy escorts used sonar, known to the British as ASDIC, to detect submerged submarines by listening for the echoes of sound pulses. Once contact was made, escorts dropped patterns of depth charges set to explode at various depths. The effect was terrifying, a series of dull booms that shook the submarine and showered crew members with dust and shards of paint. Later, the Allies introduced forward-throwing weapons, such as the Hedgehog mortar and the Squid launcher, that hurled small bombs ahead of the ship. These devices allowed escorts to maintain contact while attacking, and their charges exploded only on impact, giving crews no warning. Technology advanced rapidly. In 1941, British scientists fitted long-range patrol aircraft with centimetric radar capable of spotting the small conning tower of a submarine on the surface, even at night. By 1943, the Lee light, a powerful searchlight mounted on a plane's wing, could illuminate a surfaced U-boat seconds before bombs and machine gun fire raked its deck. The Allies also developed high-frequency direction finding, HF/DF, known to sailors as Huff Duff, which triangulated the position of a U-boat based on its radio transmissions. German radio operators used short bursts of encrypted signals, but even a few seconds of transmission could be enough for Allied shore stations to obtain a bearing. At Bletchley Park, British codebreakers laboured to crack the Enigma encryption machines that secured German communications. By late 1942, they were reading many U-boat messages in almost real time, allowing convoy routes to be altered to avoid danger or to send hunter-killer groups to intercept submarines. American industry produced thousands of ships and aircraft. Escort carriers, essentially converted merchant hulls with flight decks, allowed aircraft to accompany convoys in mid-ocean. Catalina and Liberator flying boats carried depth charges and homing torpedoes like the acoustic Fido, which could follow the sound of a submarine's propeller. Snow-white blimps patrolled the skies, spotting periscopes and guiding destroyers to their targets. On the surface, destroyer escorts were built by the hundreds, cheap, rugged ships designed specifically to hunt submarines. Each technological advance increased the odds that a U-boat would be detected, attacked, and destroyed. Black May and the fall of the U-boat arm. By the spring of 1943, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively. Allied shipyards were launching merchant vessels faster than the Germans could sink them. Convoys were now protected by multiple layers of escorts, air cover, and support groups dedicated solely to submarine hunting. New tactics, such as the escort support group concept developed by the British Admiral Frederick Walker, added an aggressive element. Instead of guarding the convoy, some ships detached to pursue and destroy U-boats whenever they were sighted. In May 1943 alone, the Germans lost 41 submarines in the North Atlantic, 34 of them in one 20-day period. The month came to be known as Black May. The abrupt surge in losses stunned Dönitz and prompted him to withdraw his forces temporarily from the heart of the Atlantic. The causes of the catastrophe were many. New crews lacked training and experience. The accelerated production of submarines in 1942 and 1943 meant that boats were launched faster than men could be schooled in navigation, engine maintenance, emergency procedures, and attack tactics. Statistics tell a grim story. More than 200 boats were lost on their first patrols. Construction flaws contributed. In the rush to output hulls, shipyards used prefabricated sections, sometimes welding them poorly or fitting inferior piping and cabling. Seawater corroded seams, and poorly insulated electrical systems shorted when depth charges rattled the hull. Tactical surprise had vanished. Allied interception of Enigma traffic gave away rendezvous points and patrol areas. Air patrols kept U-boats submerged, forcing them to crawl along at 5 knots while draining their batteries. The numbers illustrate the scale of the defeat. Of the 1,181 submarines commissioned by Germany during the war, 863 undertook combat patrols and 785 were lost. Of the 859 boats that ventured into the Atlantic, 648 were destroyed and 429 vanished with all hands. By September 1942, the bodies of more than 27,000 German submariners lay at the bottom of the sea. By 1944, the average life expectancy of a new U-boat crew was measured in weeks. Journalists wrote grimly that for anyone watching a submarine slip beneath the waves, it was as though watching men walk into their grave. Individual stories, fear and courage. Numbers strip away individuality, but behind every statistic stands a name and a story. The early aces of the U-boat arm met fates as dramatic as their triumphs. Günther Prien, celebrated as the man who sank the Royal Oak, disappeared with his boat in March 1941. Otto Kretschmer, the most successful commander in terms of tonnage, surrendered after his U-99 was depth-charged and forced to surface. Joachim Mützelberg died when he hit his head diving from his boat during a swimming break. Reinhard Suhr, a veteran of 47 patrols, was killed when his boat struck a mine in the English Channel. Even experience could not defy probability. There are other names less known, but no less poignant. The U-576, whose peacetime story is now told by marine archaeologists, made 5 patrols. During its 4th, it sank 3 ships off the American East Coast and limped home after 49 days at sea. On its 5th, in July 1942, it torpedoed the merchant vessel Bluefields and damaged 2 others. Within minutes, American escorts and aircraft launched a counterattack. Bombs straddled the submarine, and she sank with all hands. No one emerged alive. In the cold arithmetic of war, the U-576's 5 patrols resulted in a handful of ships sunk. Its destruction meant 50 men erased from the earth. Not everyone died quickly. When a boat was damaged and immobilized, it could become a steel coffin. Disabled beyond repair at depth, crews sometimes suffocated as oxygen levels dropped and carbon dioxide built up. Survivors later recalled hallucinations of mountains pressing on their chests. Others spoke of the horror of sitting in total darkness, listening to the ticking of the clock and waiting for the end. These accounts revealed that the most harrowing struggle was often internal. Yet there were also lighter moments. Some crews kept cats or dogs as mascots. One boat hosted an impromptu harmonica concert after a successful attack. Another baked a birthday cake from crushed biscuits and cocoa. Such moments of levity reinforced humanity amid the brutality. Nazi ideology and moral choices. Submarine warfare raised uncomfortable ethical questions. To Dönitz and Hitler, the blockade of Britain justified attacking any ship that carried supplies, regardless of its civilian passengers. In the early years, U-boat captains occasionally rescued survivors of torpedoed ships, sometimes towing lifeboats toward the coast. As the war intensified, such chivalry dwindled. After the Laconia incident in September 1942, in which a U-boat that stopped to pick up survivors of a torpedoed British troopship was attacked by an American bomber, Dönitz issued an order forbidding any attempt to rescue shipwrecked sailors. Commanders were instructed to leave survivors to their fate. Men like Reinhard Hardigan confessed after the war that they felt both exhilaration and guilt, the thrill of carrying out a daring strike and the anguish of watching men burn or drown. Historians continue to debate whether U-boat crews were simply soldiers following orders or participants in war crimes. The answer is blurred by context. These young men were subject to relentless indoctrination, yet many demonstrated compassion when circumstance allowed. The poems and songs they composed speak of longing for home and sorrow for lost friends, rather than hatred of the enemy. Final days and Operation Deadliest. As Allied armies crossed the Rhine in 1945 and Hitler retreated to his bunker, Dönitz, now head of state, ordered the execution of Operation Regenbogen, Rainbow, an order for all U-boat commanders to scuttle their vessels rather than surrender them. Hundreds of submarines were deliberately sunk in German harbors, fjords, and even along remote Norwegian shores. Nevertheless, 174 boats did surrender to the Allies. After the war, British and American officials decided that the remaining submarines had to be disposed of to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. In a secretive mission known as Operation Deadliest, the Royal Navy towed 116 captured U-boats into the Atlantic and sank them by gunfire and explosives. Some went down in calm seas, others broke free of their tugs and sank en route. The sight of rows of grey hulls slipping beneath the waves symbolized the end of an era. A few boats survived as museum pieces. The U-505, captured by an American hunter-killer group in June 1944, was towed across the Atlantic, studied by intelligence officers and ultimately preserved. Since 1954, it has been on display at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, where visitors can squeeze along its narrow corridors and imagine life at depth. The U-995 sits on a beach at Les Baux, near Kiel, serving as a memorial to all submariners. In France and Norway, massive concrete pens still stand, their walls 4 meters thick and their roofs pockmarked by Allied bombs. On the seabeds of the Atlantic and the Arctic lie hundreds of rusting hulls, many still classed as war graves under international law. Fate of the survivors and memory. Only about 5,000 German submariners survived the war. Many were captured after their boats were sunk. Others surrendered when Germany capitulated. They were interned in camps in the United States, Canada, and Britain. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, captured U-505 crew members were kept in isolation so that news of their capture and of the seized Enigma machine would not reach Germany. They were told the war was over months after it had ended. During captivity, they worked on farms, built roads, and even staged plays and concerts. When repatriated to a shattered Germany, these men returned to cities reduced to rubble and to families that had endured their own losses. Some emigrated, some became teachers, mechanics, or civil servants. A few spoke publicly about their wartime experiences. Most remained silent, struggling with guilt and the trauma of what they had witnessed. For decades after 1945, Germans found it difficult to talk about the submarine war. The U-boat service was held up by some as a symbol of courage and by others as a reminder of aggression. The 1981 film Das Boot, based on Lothar Günther Buchheim's novel and directed by Wolfgang Petersen, brought the claustrophobic atmosphere of a U-boat to global audiences. Viewers worldwide watched sweat-soaked faces, cramped compartments, and the unending tension between monotony and terror. The film received 6 Oscar nominations and helped shift the perception of submariners from villains to young men caught in an unforgiving machine. Memorials in Germany now honor the dead of both sides. At services marking the Battle of the Atlantic, wreaths are laid not only for German sailors, but also for the British, American, Canadian, Soviet, and merchant seamen who perished. Why we must remember. The Battle of the Atlantic lasted almost 6 years, longer than any other campaign of the Second World War. It claimed the lives of tens of thousands of sailors, soldiers, and civilians, and shaped the timing of the D-Day landings and ultimately the outcome of the war. It was a testing ground for science and industry, demonstrating how quickly new technologies could be devised and countered. It showed the extremes of bravery and cruelty that human beings are capable of. The story of the U-boats teaches us that even the most advanced weapon is powerless against superior strategy, intelligence, and moral conviction. German submarines were engineering marvels for their time, but their crews were sent into a conflict in which every error, every misjudgment, and every burst of enemy ingenuity was lethal. As Allied scientists and sailors combined their skills, the advantage of surprise evaporated. Yet the submariners continued to sail, driven by duty, patriotism, and camaraderie. 3/4 of them died because they were trapped in a war of attrition their nation could not win. When we stand on the deck of the U-505 or read the names engraved on memorials, we should not think only of tonnage sunk and convoys disrupted. We should remember the faces of young men who stared through periscopes into the blackness, who wrote letters they would never send, and who died believing they were protecting their homeland. Their sacrifice reminds us that war is not an abstraction, but a tragedy measured in lives cut short and families left grieving.